Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own Operation Swipe Right, or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Daughter to Artemis, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Dani.
Operation Swipe Right, Chapter 3, The Sightless Date. Are you certain you don't need me to stay? Sarah asked for the fourth time, her eyes pleading with Tally to change her mind. That the answer this time would actually be, yes, Sarah, stay. But as Tally smiled at her and rolled her eyes, Sarah knew the answer she received would not be the one she wanted. We'll be fine, Sarah. Tally shifted Cameron on her hip. The boy's head rested on Tally's shoulder as he stared at Sarah, his eyes lidded and sleepy. It was nearing his bedtime. Tally had offered to babysit Cameron and Gemma tonight, so that Adele and Abigail could go to dinner with Em and Gregorio. Tally had plans with Em and Gregorio later in the week, and as she had promised her sister, she was always happy to babysit. It also meant that Tally had something to do tonight, and she needed something to keep her occupied tonight. Of all nights, she needed to be occupied and not alone. Alone with only her thoughts and a great deal of alcohol to be her company did not a good evening make. Tally somewhat hated to use her niece and nephew like this, but she didn't think they'd mind her attention. It was better than Tally waiting here, in Sarah's home, for Sarah to come back from her date. A date! And Akasha had set Sarah up on a date with someone Anna had found on a dating app for witches and civilians. It was a brilliant idea, honestly, the app, not Sarah having a date from said app. It wasn't right. Tally hated the idea of Sarah dating anyone, but she also hated the mere idea of Sarah dating someone from an app. How in the world was Sarah Alder supposed to date someone she met through her daughter on a dating app on a civilian phone? A civilian phone that Sarah refused to learn how to use. Tally knew just how much Sarah refused to use cell phones because she had been the one tasked with teaching Sarah how to use them after she returned from her mycelium vacation. Tally refused to call it death. Not anymore. It was just a short 6-month vacation in the bowels of the mycelium before she returned, rejuvenated and ready to kick ass. But it was outrageous, all of it. Sarah dating anyone and using a civilian smartphone. Sarah Alder shouldn't be wined and dined like she was a woman of the 21st century. Sure, Sarah lived in this century, but she was a woman of her times. Sarah deserved to have someone court her the way she had wanted to be courted when she was a young woman, before the world had turned so cruelly against her. Sarah had expectations then. Even if from the stories Sarah had shared with Tally, Sarah had been the least interested in finding a match of her siblings. Her sister Elizabeth had been sought after by many of a young man in Salem town, as Elizabeth had been a natural beauty. Sarah, at the time, had been awkward and gangly. Her limbs were too long and her features too sharp. She hadn't grown into herself even at 17, and so there weren't many suitors seeking her attention. Though Sarah had sought the attentions of a few young women, but that was a secret only Tally knew. Auntie Tally, can we have popcorn with the movie? Gemma asked as she came around the corner. waving around a DVD case with a 3D projected image of an animated picture. Her hand was covering the title, so Sarah couldn't tell which movie they would be watching without her. Without her. That just felt wrong. Hmm. I should stay, Sarah decided. Sarah, don't be silly. Tally didn't understand why she was pushing Sarah onto this date. It was the last thing she wanted. Tally, more than anything, wanted Sarah to stay with her and the kids. She wanted Sarah to refuse to meet this male witch and stay with her. Why wouldn't Sarah just make the decision to stay with her? Tally couldn't. She couldn't ask her to stay. She wanted to. Goddess, she wanted to. She couldn't. No, this doesn't feel right. Sarah rubbed her hands down her Bill Blase black pants. They shimmered in the light and hugged her legs perfectly. The ruffled red tunic shirt with its rather deep V cut in the bust hung just beneath her hips. The soft curls of her hair as it hung low over her shoulders made her look. Wow. Gemma's mouth dropped as her eyes widened. Auntie Sarah, you are pretty. Tally snapped her head to Gemma, her eyes blown. Sarah looked to the young bellwether. Am I not normally pretty? Nuh-uh. Gemma shook her head no. Auntie Tally is normally pretty. You're not normally this pretty. Sarah blew out a long breath as Tally struggled to hold in her horrified laughter. Sadly, you're just like your grandmother. Sarah brushed her thumb over Gemma's cheek, the girl smiling brightly at the compliment as Gemma idolized her grandmother. That's why Cameron is my favorite. Gemma's mouth opened in childlike shock. Hey, Gemma pouted as Sarah tickled Cameron under his chin, making the sleepy boy giggle. Cameron snuggled tighter against Tally, even as he stared at Sarah. Auntie Sarah, pretty. Yes, she is. Very pretty. Tally kissed Cameron's forehead as she agreed with the boy. She's always pretty. The earnestness in Tally's voice caused Sarah's heart to skip within her chest. I mean, I guess. Gemma shrugged, her attention back on her red-headed aunt, who was wearing an old army t-shirt and sweatpants. A stark difference from Sarah, who was dressed to the nines. Auntie Tally, popcorn? Tally pulled her eyes away from Sarah, sad to break their stare. She looked down to the bright eyes that reminded her so much of Abigail that she couldn't even be mad at the interruption of intense eye contact. Yes, of course, Jem. We'll have popcorn with the movie. Yay! Jem threw her arms up into the air and hopped in place, seeming to do a happy dance as she wiggled while she hopped around in a circle. Off with you. Tally bumped her hip against Jem's shoulder, halting her dance. I'll be down in a few minutes. Okay. Just like, kiss goodbye already? You're worse than Ma and Abba. Jem rolled her eyes as she walked away, her steps light, thrilled because she was getting popcorn. That girl is a carbon copy of her mother, Tally stated, staring as Jem disappeared down the hallway. Oh no, it's much worse than that, Tally. She's a carbon copy of Petra, Sarah stressed, shivering as she shook her head, the easy smile on her face making Tally's sunshine bright smile make an appearance. Tally's smile was real, for the first time since she'd come to help Sarah latch the necklace she was wearing on her date. The smiles before this had been forced, fake, but she's jimmying them out, cranking each one with a great deal of effort, trying her hardest to keep her promise, trying not to put any pressure on Sarah. It had been hard, so hard, to make any kind of small talk as she helped Sarah fasten her necklace. The necklace was a white gold chain necklace with a blue sapphire teardrop at the base. It had been a gift from Rael and Scylla for Yule, the year that Willa was born. Tally's breath had hitched as she finally gotten the small loop into the hook. Her hands shook as she stared at Sarah through her standing mirror. The two of them caught frozen in a moment laden with such tension the slightest breeze could make it crack. The breeze, this time, had been Cameron, who came toddling into the room, dragging his floppy-eared bunny and his soft white and blue embroidered blanket, the blanket that he was currently swaddled tight within as Tally cradled him in her arms. The blanket had been a handmade gift. Sarah had made baby blankets for each of the children and embroidered their names into them as soon as they were announced, a family tradition that Sarah kept with her chosen family. Tally had such fond memories of watching Sarah making each of the blankets, late into the evening, sitting in front of the fire in her sitting room, her tongue sticking out just to the tip, to the left side of her lips, her eyes narrowed as she concentrated on her tasks. Always with a glass of whiskey at her side, it took her several weeks to make each blanket, but when they were finished, they were beautiful. And the work that she had imbued into each of them took Tally's breath away every time she saw them. The love and protection Sarah had weaved into each stitch of these blankets was so clear to Tally as the work swirled around the blanket like a living entity. Since Cameron had broken the moment between them, the first time, well, they had moved from Sarah's bedroom and were now standing in the foyer of Sarah's home, right in front of the front door. Front door that Sarah stubbornly refused to walk through. Sarah would not leave, making every excuse she could think of to delay her departure. First, it was to check to make sure that there was enough firewood in each of the many fireplaces scattered throughout the house, as if the baseboard heating wouldn't have kept them warm enough. But Sarah had wanted to check, so Tally had followed dutifully behind her, helping her check. Then Sarah had needed to check to make sure all the windows on the first floor were locked so no one could break in. As if anyone could get through the wards that Sarah, Petra, Tally, Abigail, Adil, Rael, Scylla, Anakasha, and Colita had put up around this home. Even if an intruder had the courage to try and break in, they would be incinerated before they made it 100 yards from the porch, let alone any of the windows. The final straw had been when Sarah had decided she couldn't possibly wear what she was wearing, and she'd gone and changed. Tally didn't know if Sarah's attempt to delay her departure was because she was nervous about her date, or if she truly wished to just stay with Tally and the kids. Tally hoped more for the latter than the former. Sarah and Tally watched Jem disappear into the entertainment room. When Sarah met Tally's eyes once more and Tally looked at her, the amusement and real smile faded. The fake Jimmy Jack smile taking its place as the softness in Tally's eyes was covered over by a gentle fog that Tally was trying desperately to blow away. Sarah swallowed as she closed the short distance between them. Tally's eyes fluttered the moment Sarah was within an inch of her, just a paper's width separating them as Cameron snuggled against her side. Tally's jaw tightened and she stiffened, her eyes staring at the smooth skin of Sarah's shoulder. Please, please, Tally begged, her very soul trembling with her wish for Sarah to please, please, please be brave. To be the one to say she wanted more, that she did not want to go on this date with this stranger because she wanted to stay with Tally and only Tally. That the only person Sarah wanted to go on a date with was her. Please, goddess. Tally wanted to weep with her desperation for Sarah to finally admit to wanting more with her. Sarah. Tally breathed the woman's name. In it held a desperation, but also a clear warning. Sarah could break her resolve. Tally knew this, but she was forced to remain silent, to be strong and silent, to let Sarah decide what would make her happiest. Tally believed that Sarah deserved to find happiness. She just wanted Sarah to find that happiness with her. Tally, Sarah whispered, her hand coming to cup Tally's cheek. Tally turned into Sarah's palm immediately, her eyes closed as she nuzzled into the touch. Goddess, it would be so easy. They were so close. She could just do as Gemma said. She could just steal the kiss she longed for. A kiss she was only ever allowed to indulge in and enjoy and relish once a year. once a year, the one day that Sarah thought they could handle such affection. And today, well, today was not that day. Today was not Beltane. That first Beltane, when they were away on a mission to apprehend Dr. Hurst. The mission had been critical, and they could not afford to refrain from participating in Beltane. They needed the power boost for the battle that was to come. They all did. Their mission had been an eventual success. They'd killed Alvin Hurst and helped end the 7-Year War. But as they were on a mission, away from Fort Salem, their options and partners for Beltane to boost their powers had been very limited. Where that might have been a limiting factor for Sarah, it hadn't been for Tally. Tally knew she wouldn't have wanted any other partner at Beltane, just as she hadn't wanted any other partner at Beltane and in life since. And therein was Tally's biggest problem. Tally had promised Sarah that should they spend that first Beltane together, it would not affect their friendship. Sarah, at the time, was suffering from her losses of the biddies, the uncertainty of what lay ahead of them after the war. What would there be beyond the death and destruction should they win, or worse, lose? Sarah had been tormented and terrified at the idea of participating in Beltane with Tally. The one relationship, the one person that Sarah trusted beyond an Akasha was Tally, and Sarah had been terrified that she'd lose her. That by giving in to the desires of the flesh, she'd lose the most meaningful relationship in her life. So, Tally promised that she wouldn't ask Sarah for more than what Sarah was willing to give to her. Tally promised she would never pressure Sarah into anything she wasn't sure of, which, according to Sarah, from that night, had been one single evening together on Beltane, and each Beltane since, for the last 4 years. But nothing more. Sarah never asked for anything more, and Tally needed to keep her word. She couldn't break it, so she never asked for anything more either. It was the hardest promise she'd ever had to keep. Yet it also had somehow become the easiest and most devastating one to keep. No matter how much more Tally wanted, how she longed to deepen her connection with Sarah, 365 days out of the year, to be Sarah's every day and not just on Beltane. Sarah had not asked. Sarah never asked Tally for more, and Tally couldn't break her word. Tally would never take advantage of Sarah's trust and faith in her, not ever again. She was so adamant about not breaking Sarah's trust ever again that her promise had become unbreakable, a vow that she physically could not break, even as she tried. The consequences of those attempts had been unpleasant. Tell me to stay, Sarah pleaded, begging Tally to be the brave one between them. All Tally needed to say was that she wanted Sarah to stay, that she didn't want her to go on this date. Any hint at all, the slightest, merest suggestion would be all that Sarah needed to stay home and to stay with Tally, to spend the night here in her home, no, their home, with their niece and nephew and watch an animated movie she'd never heard of. And Sarah would love every single moment of it. Every single one. Goddess, this wasn't fair. Tally bit her tongue. Her treacherous tongue would say all she wanted to, profess every last confession of love and desire she had for Sarah, if given that chance, if it wasn't weighed down on the base of her mouth, laden with everything she wanted to say, but couldn't. Tally's eyes were full with so much more than unshed tears, and as she opened them, Tally dropped her head forward and pressed her forehead against Sarah's, and just stayed where she was for a moment, forgetting that she cradled a sleepy toddler on her hip. Stay with us, Tally said with everything but words, begging Sarah to choose to stay with them on her own, without Tally needing to voice such desires. Cameron grinned and bumped his head against Tally's chin, trying to mimic his two aunts, as his small, sweaty hand came up to rest on the line of Sarah's jaw. Cameron's movements broke the spell in much the same way his sister's had before. Tally shook her head. She couldn't. Tally leaned back and offered a watery smile. Have fun, Sarah. Tally pressed her lips to Sarah's cheek, lingering there as she felt her heart shatter in her chest. Tally turned her back and walked away. Her knees felt like they were going to give out beneath her, but she kept her gait even, her legs and body as stiff as a board. Tally's jaw trembled and her body stiffened, her steps freezing as the front door closed. Tally bit back the pained whimper that wished to find its voice to help alleviate the pain in her chest that seemed to resonate from somewhere even deeper and more potent than her heart. So instead of focusing on that discomfort, she instead turned her focus on the boy in her arms, standing in the doorway to the entertainment room where Gemma was surely waiting before she even realized it. You ready to watch Raya and the Last Dragon 3, The Temple of Heartbud? Yeah! Cameron began chanting as he bounced a bit in Tally's arms, until his movement stopped as he looked at his favorite aunt. Allie? Cameron frowned as he put his small hands on either of Tally's cheeks. No kind, Allie. Cameron shook his head and kissed Tally's cheek, like his mother kissed his cheeks when he was sad. Eyes make better. Tally took a deep breath and stared into the sweet eyes of her nephew. You do make it all better, Cameron. Tally rubbed her nose against Cameron's, and the boy squealed with his happiness before he stuck his head against Tally's neck again. Sarah knew she had made a terrible mistake the moment she had stepped out of the door of her home, leaving Tally and the littlest bellwethers behind. It had been a terrible mistake that she didn't know how to fix. Sarah was angry with Tally, and she had just let that anger lead her away from her home and into this fine establishment. All the Nora had needed to do was ask her to stay, to say she wanted Sarah to spend the evening with her instead of going on this joke of a date. But Tally had remained silent. Or perhaps not silent. Sarah had seen how hard it had been for Tally to wish her well, to send her off to spend an evening with someone else. But Tally hadn't asked Sarah to stay. Why? Why wouldn't Tally ask her to stay when it seemed so clear that she had wanted Sarah to? Was what they shared, their yearly entanglement on Beltane, truly all Tally wished for them? Was a single night of passion all Tally sought for her? Perhaps Sarah was mistaken. Perhaps Tally did not think Sarah a good partner. Sarah was a convenience. Sarah was there every year. She was there, waiting and wanting and desperate for the touch of Tally's lips against her own, vibrating with the need that grew until it consumed her. If Sarah was only given one day out of the year where she was allowed to kiss Tally Craven, she would never take it for granted. She relished and coveted every single kiss. She longed for every touch of Tally's lips against her skin. The thrill of Tally's touch was the sweetest kind of intoxication. Sarah was infatuated with every touch, every taste, every lingering kiss. She was obsessed with every sound Tally released. The moans, groans, the breathless grunts and gasps, the keening wails and goddess, the choke utterances of Sarah's name. Sarah thought about the next time she could meld her body so completely to Tally's that she was lost, as neither of them existed without the other, every single day. Yet all she was given was Beltane. So all she took was Beltane, and Sarah relished those blissful moments where they were one. Sarah was Tally's Beltane lover, but she wanted to be so much more. Sarah wasn't just angry with Tally, she was angry with herself as well. She should never have agreed to this date in the first place. It was all a farce. She had no intentions of seeing this man again after this evening. She only agreed so that she could tell Anakasha that she tried and perhaps dating just wasn't what Sarah Alder was meant to do. Dating. Modern dating was a strange and confusing phenomenon to Sarah. There was no such thing as dating when she grew up. There were courtships. There were finite rules and definitive structure to all social interactions with anyone you fancied. People had to ask permission to court you before they began seeing you socially. There were gifts given, promises made, and detailed, outlined steps, even contracts. Courtships during her time were clear and concise, just the way Sarah liked things. Sitting at dinner with a man Sarah had never met before was not how she wished to spend her evening. She did not wish to make small talk. How in the world was she meant to make small talk with this man, with any man or woman for that matter? Small talk. Really. Anna had gone and lost her mind. Was Sarah meant to sit here and speak with this man about her countless centuries alive? What kinds of questions would he ask her? Surely he had plenty of questions, but would he be polite and not pry? Or would he try and delve into her history? Or worse yet, would he pretend to know her because he read all about her in the many history books about her life? Sarah's heart was just not in this. How could it be? Her heart was back in her home, sitting in their entertainment room, watching an animated movie curled up between two bellwethers, which is exactly where Sarah wished to be. I'm sorry. My stories are surely rather boring in comparison to the many experiences you've had. David, he was sweet, kind even. He was handsome, a few inches taller than Sarah herself, with muscular shoulders. And damn Anna, she'd gone and found a redhead. He was clean shaven, with one left cheek dimple, and had a head of slick back red hair. The eyes weren't right. He had blue eyes, and to anyone else he would be attractive. To Sarah, he had passing similarities to the woman she would have much rather been seated across from. Sarah sipped her whiskey. I suppose there is a lack of adventure to them. David's eyes widened and he grinned, agreeing, even as Sarah sighed. She had been joking. Her dry sense of humor completely lost on the man across from her. How tedious modern dating was, to have to open oneself up to a relative or complete stranger and hope that there was something there, a hook that kept you connected, or at least mildly interested in learning more. It was like those old theatrical comedies that Sarah had attended while young, where if the crowd was not enjoying the entertainment, the performers were giving the hook, pulled right off the stage. Sometimes the sight of them stumbling from the stage was the funniest part of their bits. Sarah put her empty glass down on the table in front of her. The meal they shared so far had been pleasant enough. David did seem like a nice young man in his mid-40s, but everyone was young to Sarah Alder. There had been a few moments where Sarah had been generally entertained by some of his stories, even if she hadn't shown it. She was very good at keeping her composure. She had centuries to practice at it. But Sarah just wanted to go home. Even if her time was spent with a woman who only found her worthy to be her partner during Beltane and not in everyday life, Sarah did not care. She had lived through so many lifetimes where she had never had the desire to spend her life by someone's side, not willingly. So she would happily take whatever capacity she was given. Sarah did not wish to look for anything more. If all Tally Craven wanted from her was friendship, Sarah would happily accept that, so long as she had a place in Tally's life for the rest of hers. I do apologize, David. I just have a great deal on my mind. Well, I'm not a therapist by trade, but I've been told I'm a good listener. That is, if it's not too private or confidential a matter. Sarah considered his offer. Decision made, Sarah raised her hand to get the attention of the waiter that had been assigned their table, and she lifted her empty glass to signal another should be brought over. Knock, knock! Anakostia called out into the house as she poked her head into the slightly ajar space. The lights were off, and it looked like no one was home from the outside. But Anakash knew that Tally Craven and Sarah Alder were somewhere in this house. It was nearing 11 p.m. Her mother would surely be back from her date, and Anakasha was too anxious to hear how it went. She could have waited until the next morning, at a more respectable hour, but she couldn't possibly wait that long. She wouldn't get any sleep. The light on the second floor by the stairs flipped on, illuminating the second floor landing and the stairs themselves, casting the foyer into shadows. Anna? Tally called out as she came to the banister of the second floor landing, eyes squinting as she tried to see who was at the door. And Akashta came in through the door and closed it behind her. drawing her mother's sigil that would ward it and lock it against anyone that Sarah hadn't worked into the working, a habit to protect all of their spaces and homes since the war. Tally was wearing her pajamas, a matching set that looked incredibly comfortable, though not Anakosht's style at all. She much preferred to sleep in the nude, a habit she knew she had not inherited from her adopted mother, who always wore a nightgown. Tally, is my mother in bed already? Anakostia frowned. She hadn't thought this through. Normally, Sarah Alder was up into the wee hours of the morning, a habit that she could not break after she had gone without sleep for so long. On a good day, Sarah Alder maybe got 3 hours of sleep, 4 if she was lucky, but it wasn't a hindrance for her like it would have been for any other mere mortals. In the dim light, Anacostia caught a glimmer of tears in Tally's eyes, tears that the knower did her best to hide, or justify away as she rubbed her eyes if she were just rubbing the sleep from them. No, she's not. Oh, is she in the study then? Anacostia was already walking towards the mentioned room when Tally's words stopped her. She isn't in the study. Anacostia stared directly up, neck arched up, her position just letting her see the tips of Tally's toes as she stood above her on the second-floor landing. She hasn't come home yet. Anacostia smiled brightly. The date was going well if they had been on it for 4 hours. That was great news. Surprising, unexpected, and slightly disturbing news, but great news. Except the excitement that Anacostia felt swelling in her heart was squashed by the pain she heard in Tally's voice. Tally, hey, you okay? Anacostia asked as she took several steps backwards, so she could keep an eye on Tally as she maneuvered towards the stairs. Trying not to race up them when she saw those tears Tally was trying to keep from falling, were now painting a path down her cheeks. I'm fine, Tally lied, waving away Anacostia's concerns and stepping away from her approaching sister. I'm just tired. Tally took another step away, but Anacostia kept coming. Jet lag, she swore, lying through her teeth. Uh-huh. Anacostia reached out and pulled Tally into her arms. Tally eventually, reluctantly, moved into her arms. You're still a terrible liar. Tally chuckled through her tears, hiding her face against Anacostia's shoulder. Her arms tightened around her eldest sister. The silent tears turned into sobs into the safety of Anacostia's arms. Oh, Tally, come on, let's go. Anacostia led Tally down the hallway to Tally's room. Tally's room was the second largest room in the house, second only to Sarah's, which was on the other end of the hallway. It was as if Sarah had deliberately put Tally in the room farthest from her own, as if the distance would stop Sarah, maybe Tally, from giving into the temptation of wandering into each other's rooms in the middle of the night. As if they hadn't done just that the first few years after the war, both of them needing to be sure the other was safe. Sarah would have nightmares about the time Tally had been taken and needed the reassurance that Tally was safe, while Tally needed the comfort of Sarah's arms around her for several months after the war. As far as Anacostia knew, those sleepovers had stopped. As far as she knew. Once they were in the room, Anacostia brought them over to the 3-seater couch by the fireplace. Tally's room was more like a private suite or a mini apartment. The first door opened up into a small sitting room with a fireplace. There were also 2 doors, one to the left and to the right along the far wall. The door to the left led into Tally's bedroom, which also had its own fireplace. Almost all the rooms and bedrooms had fireplaces, as the house was designed and modeled after colonial homes before baseboard heating and boilers were a thing. The door to the right led into a private in-suite bathroom that had a magnificent tub, one that Anacostia was jealous of, along with a modern shower. On the opposite end of this sitting area, there was an office-like setup, a bookcase filled with books, and a small writing desk in front of a window overlooking the south end of Sarah's property, a small pond just within view when seated at the desk. It was as if Sarah had set up this room to offer the best views, and instead of taking it for herself, she had given it to Tally. I'm sorry. You don't have to say it. I'm fine, Tally promised as she took a seat on the couch and immediately curled up against the arm of it. resting her head on the backrest as she wrapped her arms around her knees. Right, because you look fine, Anacostia huffed, shaking her head. Now tell me straight, Craven. Why are you so upset? I am. If you say fine again, I'm going to set your hair on fire. Pants. What? Liars. Their pants. That's what's set on fire, not their hair. Anacostia shook her head, trying to fight back a grin, because of course Tally would correct her and tell her what she should actually set on fire. At least Tally was admitting she was lying. That was a start, but only a small start. It would take a lot more for the heart of the matter to come out, but Anacostia was patient. Mostly. Kind of. Anacostia stared intently at the redhead, knowing that the alder stare would get the girl to talk without Anacostia having to say anything else. Tally sighed heavily, wiping angrily at her eyes. It's stupid, I know. No, it's so stupid. I am so stupid. Stupid about what? Tally tilted her head as she stared into Anacostia's eyes, as if she expected her sister to know, to understand exactly what had upset her without having to verbalize it. Sarah. Tally whispered the woman's name. In the two syllables, there was a waterfall of rushing emotion that fell over the ledge far too quickly for Anacostia to catch them all. But they were there, illuminated by the softness of the name. With a single word, the name and all that was spoken within it sucker punched Anacostia. Her eyes widening, Anna watched how uncomfortable and embarrassed Tally became, how dejected and small. Tally's chin wobbled all over again as her eyes filled with brand new big fat tears. Still? Anacostia asked, wanting to slap herself when those fat tears fell and made her feel like the biggest bitch. I'm sorry, I thought, I thought you and Sarah. Sarah! Anacostia could not call Sarah her mother when she was about to talk about her sex life. Got this out of your system. Tally rolled her eyes, laughing even as she continued to cry. 4 years and counting, and I count the days until the next beltane. Anacostia cringed internally. She forced her face to remain neutral outwardly. Tally did not need to be contending with her discomfort as she spoke about this. I love her so much. I would fall at her feet every day if she let me. That was both romantic and disturbing. Anna much preferred to just imagine Tally literally falling and showing her reverence of her mother as she bowed before her, not, anything sexual. Tally, I don't understand. If it isn't just sexual and it's been going on for so long. Wait until Anacostia could confirm that Rael was right. Damn her! She owed the fixer far too much money. Sarah and Tally had been spending Beltane together for years. Then why aren't you two together? Tally sighed, pulling her knees tighter to her as she leaned over them. It's complicated. What's complicated about this, Tally? Sarah loves you more than she loves anyone. Even her, it was a different kind of love. But Anacostia knew if Sarah ever had to make a choice between her and Tally, Sarah would choose Tally. Sarah would always choose Tally. And the reason why Sarah loved and would choose Tally every time was because Tally would never expect Sarah to choose her. Tally would never want to be chosen over Anacostia or anyone else. Tally would rather put herself in danger for them all, for Anacostia and Sarah and her sisters and their friends. Tally would die for all of them 10 times over, and that kind of sacrifice resonated and frightened them all deeply. Tally squeezed her eyes closed. She doesn't want more. Anacostia stared, unbelieving. You are the blindest knower I've ever met. Tally snapped her head up, her eyes red. What? Anacostia wanted to shake Tally. Sarah loves you, Tally. She doesn't just want more with you, she wants everything with you. Tally stared, her mouth opening and closing, but nothing came out. But, but, but what? She hasn't said anything, Tally lamented, miserable. Have you said anything? Tally shook her head. No. Anacostia pinched the bridge of her nose and counted to 3 before she spoke, calming herself. Then why do you think she's going to? The more Tally thought about this, the less sad she was becoming. Instead, she was getting angry. If it was so obvious that Sarah wanted more with Tally, why hadn't she said anything? Because I can't. Anacostia was surprised by the angry outburst. What do you mean, you can't? I can't. I can't ask her for more. Tally covered her mouth with both hands, latched around it, and screamed her frustration into her palms. I can't say anything, Anna. Anacostia's eyes widened. You worked yourself? It was an accident, Tally whimpered. It was an accident. I didn't mean to. Goddess, I've tried to break it. I've wanted to say so much to her so many times, but I promised. I promised her I wouldn't push her for more. It was part of our agreement. Anacostia eyes narrowed. What agreement? That first Beltane, we made an agreement. I promised I wouldn't ask for anything more than, just us being together that night. That everything would just stay the same and that we wouldn't lose our friendship. That being partners together, that Beltane, we wouldn't risk everything we built together. She'd been so nervous and, I don't know, hesitant. So I promised I wouldn't take anything more than what she was offering. Oh, I would only take what she offered. Never asked for more. And I meant it so much, I did. I meant it so much that I worked myself into the promise. I can't tell her I want more. Tally's tears slid unbidden down her cheeks, and all Anacostia could do was stare in helplessness as Tally explained why it was taking her and her mother so long to figure their shit out. Sarah, she promised she'd tell me if she thought we couldn't sleep with each other and still be us. She said that she'd tell me if she wanted more. I promised her. I promised I wouldn't push, and I pushed myself right into that well, one I can't break. Anacostia was developing a headache as she was thinking so hard. But then the next Beltane? And the next? And the one after that? And just this year, too. Tally sighed wistfully, her eyes staring off as she were remembering in vivid detail the second Beltane she spent with Sarah. Sarah came to me. I hadn't sought her out, was keeping my promise, but she came looking for me. She told me that we could still be us and have more Beltane. Ah, Anacostia sighed. Just on Beltane. And that's what you've been doing. Anacostia needed to smack both of them upside the head. Or perhaps just Sarah, since poor Tally was locked in the same working that kept the rest of them quiet about their knowledge of Tally's feelings for Sarah. What was taking Sarah so long? Did she even remember the promises that she'd made to Tally that first Beltane? Was she just scared to ask for more because Tally hadn't? Was Sarah trying to be noble and not push her own feelings onto Tally? When poor Tally couldn't even voice her own feelings to Sarah. Tally nodded firmly. If Sarah wanted more, all she'd have to do was say she did. I haven't been with anyone else in 4 years. Which didn't feel as long as it actually was. She lived every year looking forward to Beltane and being with Sarah. Sarah flew to Germany. She was in Germany during Beltane. Anacostia verbalized it aloud. Tally blushed as she confirmed what Anacostia was slowly figuring out. Yeah, she was with me. What else am I supposed to do, Anna? Tally's bottom lip trembled as tears filled her eyes again. I love her. I don't want anyone else. I just want her. 4 years, Anacostia asked in dismayed shock. You've been waiting 4 years for my mother to say something. I haven't, Anna. I haven't been able to say I love her to her in 4 years. Tally looked devastated at that. Not even when I do. She wouldn't need to know I love her. There's more, but I know and I can't say it. I haven't been able to say it in 4 years. So she'd done her best to show it. She'd become a great deal more tactile with Sarah in the last 4 years, and Sarah had seemingly welcomed that affection, seeing as she never once complained about it. Oh, Tally. Anakostia wanted to reach out and comfort her sister, but at the slightest movement, Tally jerked backwards, leaning away from her. And you can't find a way to just tell her that? Anakostia knew how powerful Tally's new workings were. She and the rest of her family was trapped in one that they couldn't break. They hoped it would break when Sarah and Tally admitted they were a couple, and then finally they could talk to Sarah about how she felt for Tally. But until then, they were stuck, and it seemed Tally was stuck as well. 4 years was a long time, a lot of wasted time. I made a promise, and I won't ever break her trust and faith in me again. It just won't. Oh, there it was, the biggest piece of the puzzle. Tally wouldn't risk breaking Sarah's trust, even if in this situation it wouldn't be terrible for Tally to push the boundaries a little. But even 10 years later, Tally's betrayal of Sarah in the hangar bay during Nikita's execution was still there. It was the darkest and most complicated part of Sarah and Tally's history, but it was just one small part of their complex relationship. Still, it was a clear reason why Tally's workings had made her promise an unbreakable vow, had pushed so deep into Tally's psyche that she was physically incapable of breaking it. The working refused to break, and so Tally was unable to be the one to ask Sarah for more, even if it was all she wanted. Tally was kept trapped in her own work, and because she was, Sarah said nothing, and nothing between them changed. Well, that wasn't true. A lot had changed in the last 4 years, but the way Sarah and Tally interacted with each other wasn't one of them. They were still as close as they had been before. They still touched each other more often than they didn't. They were still so attuned with each other that they hardly needed to speak aloud sometimes to have full conversations. When they were together, they appeared for all the world like the envied, totally still in love with each other after all these years. A married kind of couple. And yet, they weren't even dating. They only had sex with each other once a year, and then went back to not being married while acting like they were. The rest of them had just gotten used to how close Sarah and Tally were. For several years, they had all thought that Sarah and Tally were actually together, and they never told them. Back then, they had been at war, and any one of them could have died. Goddess, Rael had died and had been brought back to life, but was now bound to Fort Salem until Isadora found a way to ensure her health away from the mycelium. Khalida and Tally had both almost died in the war against the Camarilla, kidnapped together and experimented on for weeks before they'd been found. Gregoria had been forced to retire as his throat had been slit and his vocal cords rendered workless, but he lived. Em had lost several fingers in a bombing. Petra walked with a cane and a leg brace now, as she had severe nerve damage to her spine that affected her left leg. And Akasha had been in physical therapy for 2 years and was no longer allowed in active duty, which was why she'd been given her role as Major General and given a desk job at Fort Salem. The injury had been caused in the same attack that had killed Sterling. It had only been Sterling throwing himself on top of her that had saved her life. Tally herself had been in a coma for almost 4 months after the Camarilla's assassination attempt on her, as they learned she was the reason the witches were defeating all of their technological advancements. They had also been after Khalida and Tally, had been kidnapped and held hostage, tortured for weeks. It was why Khalida was so protective of Tally. They had only each other in that dark time before they'd been rescued. The war had been long and grueling for all of them. They had all felt like they were living on borrowed time. So no one said anything about Tally and Sarah's not so secret relationship until after the war was over. And Akasha could still remember Abigail's slack jaw expression as she stared at Tally like she didn't recognize her. What do you mean you and Alder aren't together? Yeah, Tal. I mean, it's totally okay if you are. There's nothing to be ashamed about. Rael, ever the voice of reason, tried to keep things calm between Tally and Abigail and soften the harshness of Abigail's shock. I'm not ashamed. I would never be ashamed. I'd be. Tally was going to say honored, but decided she didn't need her cheeks to get any redder than they already were. It just. We're not together like that. Wait, wait. Abigail raised her hand and shook her head each time she told them all to wait. You mean you aren't sleeping with Sarah? Tally scratched the back of her neck. I mean, we've shared a bed like 100 times or more during the war, but we're not having sex during that time. Goddess. Tally had looked scandalized at even the idea of it, scandalized and aroused at the idea. Beltane was one thing. It was one glorious, splendid, satisfying thing. But that was only the once, and Sarah had made it clear that she would not risk their friendship for a sexual relationship. Beltane provided a restraint and confined the scope of their sexual exploits to one day, once. And that would be it, because that was all Sarah thought they could have. Tally thought they could have it all. She wanted to tell Sarah as much, but she bound herself into this silence and would find happiness in it. She had no other choice. So you're not sleeping together. I mean, having sex with each other. Rael asked for clarification, and at Tally's nod continued. So, are you guys just not interested in having sex with each other, but you're romantically involved? A romantic and non-sexual relationship is valid and meaningful, just like any type of relationship. What in the world are you talking about, shitbird? Non-sexual romantic relationship? What? Is that like a, a thing in civilian culture? Abigail paled. How is that a thing? Why is that a thing? I'll explain it to you later, Abs. Rael promised as she patted her very sex-positive and sex-favorable witch culture-centric friend on the shoulder. But really, Tals, are you and Alder in a platonic relationship? Tally was as red as she ever been. We're just friends, you guys. That love each other, Anacostia stressed. Tally didn't even hesitate before answering. Of course we love each other. Rael was next to point something out. And hold hands. I mean, I hold your hands too. Which was true. She did. Abigail rolled her eyes. You gaze sickeningly sweet and lovey-dovey into each other's eyes. I don't do that, do I? Tally blinked. Oh, goddess, does she do that? Tally's eyes grew wider and wider as Rael, Abigail, and Akasha and Scylla each listed off the many things she and Alder did that made them all think that they were dating. Abigail continued. And you have your own language of facial expressions. Yeah, but so do you and Adele. The raised eyebrow was all Tally needed to know that she just proved Abigail's point. Rael brought up something none of them really wanted to think about, but did help prove their point. And Alder maimed the hell out of those dickwads that hurt you, and taunted us with them having touched you while in their custody. Touch was a kind way of putting it. When Tally had been captured by a Camarilla strike team, they'd threatened to do a lot of terrible things to her. They had done a great deal to her, and Kalida, and they paid for every threat and action at Sarah's hands. For every tear Tally had shed, and every bruise painting her skin, and for every day Tally remained unconscious, Sarah had unleashed a fury unlike they had ever seen on those men. Tally had been unconscious, lost to the coma they'd put her in, and hadn't seen the hellfire that Sarah had rained down on her enemies. But the stories were now legendary. Tales of how Sarah literally walked into the infirmary where Tally was being held, drenched in blood. So much blood that every step left a full footprint in her wake. Her skin lathered in it like it was suntan lotion after storming the facility where Tally and Kalida had been held, were still whispered about. Sarah had been an image to behold that night. Scylla pushed forward, cutting through the dark tension that had filled the group as they recalled that unforgiving memory. And you're the only one she falls asleep on. Literally on. She lays out on your lap like a cat. It's the cutest and strangest thing to see that lanky, tall-ass woman curled up like that on you. Scylla almost looked like she was talking about an actual cat, and not General Sarah Alder. Her face bespoke how cute and strange she found it. She doesn't even lay on me like that, and I'm her kid, Anakostia pointed out, which gained her a whole lot of approving nods, sure that their points would finally be made now. I mean, she is really cute when she falls asleep like that, isn't she? Ah, wait, no, it's that not fair. You said it yourself. She's cute when she. Oh, damn it! Stop looking at me like that. We're just friends. Uh-huh. We don't buy it. Abigail and Rael crossed their arms and shook their heads. And Akasha and Scylla just looked at Tally like she was going to have to try a lot harder to convince them that she and Sarah were together. Look, please, I promise we're not dating. We're not having sex, and we're not in a platonic romantic relationship. We're just really close. And Tally started to laugh even as tears formed. So what if I'm madly in love with her? It doesn't matter because she's not. And I'm just so not anywhere near her league. Tally wiped at the tears furiously. I won't lose what I have with her. I wouldn't risk that. Not for anything. And telling her that I think she's the only person I want to spend the rest of my life with, it'll ruin what we have. Because it'll get awkward and she won't want to spend time with me anymore in some chivalrous sense of duty. She won't want to hurt me by possibly leading me on. That would kill me. So, can we pretend like this conversation never happened? And Goddess, please don't mention this to Sarah, okay? Promise me, please. Tally had begged them, tears in her eyes as she confessed to having unrequited feelings for Sarah that she truly believed would never be returned. And the fear in her eyes as she thought of Sarah turning away from her to somehow protect Tally resonated with all of them, that they each promised not to bring it up to Sarah. And to this day, they hadn't. Though, and Akasha now wished she'd never made that promise. Maybe it would have helped sooner. So, they let it go. For the most part, they hadn't had any other choice. The promises bound them to their words. They wouldn't and couldn't talk to Sarah about Tally being in love with her and Sarah being in love with Tally. Anakostia and the rest of them had thought Tally was trying to move on. Sure, 3 years ago, Anakostia saw Sarah and Tally disappearing together on their first Beltane back on Fort Salem, which, now as Anacostia did the math, was actually their second Beltane together. But she hadn't seen them together since, and Tally was a social person. She saw people during her travels, or so Anacostia had thought. But if Tally were telling the truth, and there was no reason to think she wasn't, then Tally hadn't seen anyone romantically in 4 years. Are you still scared she won't feel the same? They'd all known that Tally was scared. Had they waited too long? Tally had been scared that no matter how obvious it was that Sarah loved her, she'd still reject her. But now there was more to that fear. It was a vow, an unbreakable one, that kept Tally quiet, even without the fear. I I don't know any more. Tally whispered her honest answer, unable to meet Anacostia's eyes. But it doesn't matter. She's not home, Anna. Tally stared at the fireplace, wishing that the logs in it were lit so she could let the flames mesmerize her. She's obviously enjoying her date, or she'd be home already. So it doesn't matter any more. Tally pressed her forehead against her bent knees and squeezed her eyes closed to try and stem the flow of her tears. It's too late. No, and Akasha shook her head. That was unacceptable. It was not too late. Now that she knew Tally wanted more, just like she was sure her mother wanted more, it was not too late. Not by a long shot. No, Tally, it's not. How do you figure? Tally asked, her voice muffled from where she remained hidden against her legs. I have a plan. Tally slowly lifted her head up, peeking her eyes over the top of her knees to look at Anacostia. And when have my plans ever failed? Well, Tally could think of two plans that hadn't panned out all that great, but 2 out of 30 still left Anacostia success rating in the high top 10 percentile. And at this point, what did she have to lose? Anna, I appreciate your efforts here. I do, but I went on the date with David and we had a lovely time. But I am not interested in seeing him again. And Akasha would have been more surprised that her mother had a great time with David if she hadn't been hiding in Tally's room waiting to see what time she came home the other evening. Surprisingly, Sarah hadn't returned until after midnight, which certainly hadn't set well with Tally, and had caused Lenora to get some pretty icy cold feet. But Anacostia was able to convince her to go along with her plan. It would work. She had faith. That's fine. I have someone even better for your next date. Sarah sighed. No, Anna, you're not hearing me. Sarah pinched the bridge of her nose. She and Anacostia were sitting in her new office, the office where she held office hours between the classes that she was teaching at the War College and spent a great many hours of her workday. It was much smaller than her old one, but had a far more welcoming atmosphere than her prior office. Now that she did not need an office space large enough to fit 7 additional women comfortably, the size didn't matter. Though pictures of her biddies from as far back as the mid-1800s were placed around her office, in silent memoriam to the selfless women that she missed dearly. Ah, Sarah tried not to think about what Devon would be saying about all this dating. Surely her comments would have ranged from shock, outrage, to downright inappropriate humor. I'm not interested in seeing anyone else from your dating app. Listen, Ma. No, Anacostia. I'm saying no. Sarah's voice rose just enough to show how serious she was about this. She would not allow herself to be persuaded to go on another date. She had made up her mind. David had been very helpful with his insightful words and encouragement. It had been somewhat useful to get the perspective of someone outside of her life to decide what she was going to do about her, hopefully, requited love for Tally Craven. Even if it turned out that her love for Tally was unrequited, then at least she would know. And should the time ever come where she was ready to move on, she could, rather than being stuck in this limbo of wanting and hoping and not knowing. David had listened to Sarah's long history with Tally, as how could he have a full-bodied opinion if he did not know the full story? It had taken hours, of course, to explain the complexity and length of their relationship. But David had sat there, encouraging and offering comments as she went. By the end, the restaurant had been closing, and they'd needed to move their conversation to a bar that was open until the wee hours of the morning. It was harder to speak there, so David had offered to bring Sarah to his home where they could talk. Sarah had been weary, but she had gone, and David had been a gentleman and true to his word. He offered her a decent whiskey, and he listened, and then finally offered his advice. Sound advice. Wouldn't you rather know? You've trapped yourself in this place where you cannot grow or evolve or change. You're both stagnant, waiting for someone to do or say something. Eventually, that will eat away at your friendship. So you either let it slowly erode what you've built, or you take a chance and see if she feels the same way. David thought it was so easy. It cannot be that easy. The only one making this hard is you and Miss Craven. When Sarah looked unconvinced, he continued. Think about it this way, Sarah. You've waited 10 years already. We wouldn't have been together 10 years ago. That would have been inappropriate as I was her CO and fine, fine. You've waited the last 4 years. He tilted his head as if asking her if the 4 years was accurate. She nodded her acceptance as she sipped at her whiskey. Now imagine waiting another 3 years to do or say something. That's 7 years. And when you finally do say something, what if she felt the same way all along? You'd have wasted 7 years being scared and afraid. Sarah picked at the fringe of her shirt, wanting to stand and place her hands behind her back where they were most comfortable. But what if it ruins our friendship? Then it wasn't much of a friendship to begin with. David frowned as he put his drink down and turned more fully toward Sarah on the couch. You mentioned how your family is pushing Miss Craven to find someone. Sarah nodded, and he didn't mention how her family was also looking for Sarah to find someone too, if he had to. He'd bring that up next. What if she does? Sarah stiffened at the thought. She finds someone else because she thinks you aren't an option. What then? Sarah would beat herself up over it for the rest of her life. What remained of it, at least. By the true end of the evening, feeling buzzed and brave while sitting in a cab headed for Fort Salem and the house that held the love of her life, Sarah had decided she was going to take David's advice, and she was going to tell Tally how she felt. Tally was in town for another 8 days. In that time, Sarah was going to find the courage to tell her how she felt and how she wanted more from their relationship. Sarah would finally ask Tally if they could renegotiate the current terms of the relationship. It seemed simple to Sarah. Sarah did not only want to be Tally Craven's lover on Beltane, she wanted to be in a committed, sexual and romantic relationship with Tally every day of the year, which would mean they were free to have sex with each other whenever they both wished, whenever the mood struck them, which Sarah feared might be every day for quite some time, if not multiple times a day. Oh, and goddess, how long had it been since she wanted to be with a lover that often? Never. The answer was never. Tally Craven was one of a kind, and Sarah was done running from how she felt. Anacostia was a bit shocked. Her mother was truly shutting her down. Instead of making her weary, that gave her hope. Would you consider it for me, please? Anacostia asked again, pouting as she stuck her bottom lip out and gave her mother what used to be her puppy dog eyes. These round, slightly wet eyes and quivering lip had gotten her just about anything she'd ever wanted or asked for as a child. They'd also help her get out of some serious trouble as a teenager and young woman. Sarah's glare did not waver, even with the use of the puppy dog eyes. Damn, she was serious. Time to retreat and come at this from a completely different angle. Anacostia sighed. I need a wing woman. I asked Isadora to go on a date with me. Sarah's glare softened as she suddenly appeared shocked, but supremely happy. It's about time. She said yes, of course. Anacostia bit her tongue. Don't say anything, don't say anything, don't say anything, she said, about her mother being a hypocrite for keeping her feelings for Tally to herself for as long as she did. There, she said it in her head, but she didn't say it out loud. Yes, she said yes. Anacostia blushed. Now she was going to have to actually ask Isadora out on a date. I am happy for you, daughter. And Anacostia tried not to cry at just how obvious Sarah's happiness for her was. Thank you, Ma. She's nervous, I'm nervous, and I thought maybe going on a double date would make things less awkward and nerve-wracking. Sarah's eyes narrowed. You wish for me to go on your first date with Isadora? Anacostia shrugged and wouldn't meet her mother's eyes. Because no, goddess, no. No, she would not want her mother to go with her on her first date with Isadora. But for this moment in time? Yes, she said. But why? Anacostia had to come up with something quick that would convince her mother. You're friends with her, and it might make her feel more comfortable if she thinks she has your approval, and you could help make sure that things don't get too quiet or awkward, or, I just want this to go well. I really do like her. And I'm worried that if this doesn't go well, then our friendship could be at stake, and I don't want that. Sarah didn't seem completely convinced, but she did seem sympathetic, and Anacostia knew why that would be. It was the same situation Sarah was currently in with Tally. Though, to be fair, at least Sarah and Tally had an arranged sexual relationship already. Anacostia was going from being very close friends with Isadora to possibly more, after she actually invited the woman out on a date now, because there was no way Sarah wouldn't ask Isadora about their double date or mention it to the scientist for the evening of. Sarah leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms, hating that she was considering this. But there wasn't much she wouldn't do for her daughter when asked, and seeing how nervous Anacostia was just talking about this, Sarah thought it was sweet for her to want Sarah to be there. odd and very out of character, but sweet. Who would be my date for this evening? Anakosta's eyes sparkled as she leaned forward, her excitement oozing from her as she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she had her mother right where she wanted her. She's this really pretty officer that Isadora thinks she'll like, and apparently hasn't been out on a date in a while. She's kind of hung up on someone else, so you wouldn't really have to go out with her again if you don't want to. She's just Isadora's cushion, while you're mine. Sarah didn't understand that phrase, but she was put at ease, knowing that the woman she was going to be dating was not in fact someone interested in a romantic relationship with her. Sarah felt her heart clenched in her chest. She knew what it was like to pine for someone she thought she could not have. Sarah narrowed her eyes. When is this double date? Anakostia bit her bottom lip. Tomorrow night. Sarah's eyes widened. Tomorrow? Seeing how nervous and antsy Anakostia was sealed her fate. Even this would mean having an awkward conversation with Tally about canceling their dinner plans for the night. Tally had offered to teach her how to cook. Sarah was looking forward to it. Every few months, Tally tried to teach Sarah how to cook a new meal. Just one meal. It was a useless endeavor, Sarah knew this, but Tally was adamant that they try. That they'd find one meal Sarah could make well. But it was all an excuse to have Tally close. Leaning over her shoulder as she instructed Sarah on how much each ingredient to add, how to whisk or mix or stir the proper way. Sarah adored her cooking lessons with Tally, even if after the lesson she hardly remembered a single thing other than the touch of Tally's hand and the brush of her breath against her ear, and the beautiful, encouraging smile. It was a lot for Sarah to give up her cooking lesson with Tally, but this was for Anakostia, her daughter. Very well. Sarah sounded far from thrilled, but determined, and Anakostia's smile was worth it. The things she did for her daughter.
Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.